Hello, my name is Lindsay Grace. I'm the Armstrong Professor of Creative Arts, the Director of the Miami University Persuasive Play Laboratory, and the Co-Director of the Game Center at the Armstrong Institute for Interactive Media Studies. I apologize for my not being present at Academic Mindtrek. I was very excited to attend. Unfortunately, as many of you know, there's more things to do than there is time in the day. So, without much further delay, I'd just like to get into my presentation. Thanks for attending. So basically what we did was we analyzed 200 games designed to modify player perspective, understanding, interests, activities, or opinions. These include adver games, games for change, educational games, and what people generally call persuasive games. Our methodology was fairly straightforward. We conducted our study between June 2011 and December 2011, using an international collection of randomly selected games. We had 5 researchers leaving their data in one relational database. They were all trained using standard tools, and we conducted a standardized training mechanism. We were concerned about making sure that there was reasonable intercoder reliability, so every coder shared a 10% game overlap. So every week when people were coding their games, the researchers were coding their games, they are actually overlapping with about 10% of someone else's coding responsibility for that week. We noticed no significant variance statistically for the reported data. Overall, we recorded 55 attributes for every game that we studied. The subset presented here reflects 150 games, and briefly will describe the development, design, and experience. Development. So 92% of the games that we studied were web-based play. That includes Flash, Java, JavaScript, or HTML5. It generally looks like this. There was overlap, so some games were available as both Windows download and web playable. But overall, only 9% of the games were available as Windows downloads, and only 5% were available as Mac downloads. So the vast majority of them, 92%, were web playable. The ones that weren't included games like Wolf Quest, which is a 214 meg download, and simpler games that are not in 3D, like Harpooned, with an 11 meg download. 76% of the games we studied required a mouse or a single-touch interaction, such as a single-point touch device, and then 56% required keyboard interactions. 81% of the games could be completed in less than 1 hour, and they looked like games like this one, a game that's supposed to promote the Thomas & Friends brand of children's toys. In terms of design, we broke the games into several categories. We considered games that advertise a product, create a social impact, provide training, or advertise a service. Overall, the distribution looks like this. 68% of the games were designed to advertise a product. In this case, this is Battle of the Cheetos, to promote the Cheetos brand of chips. 25% of the games we studied were social impact games, and so Darfur is Dying is probably one of the most emblematic of that category. And then there were education and training games that represented about 10% of the games we studied. Here depicted is The Great Piggy Bank Adventure, created by Disney. And 8% advertised service. So in this case, Suitcase Skyway is a game to promote United Airlines' ability to have you ship your luggage. We also had a category of Other, which people ask questions about. Basically, that included games that didn't really fit into any of the other categories. And a good example of that is Faith Fighter, which is created by the group Mole Industria. This game is actually sort of a critique of social situations and social conflict around war. And so that really didn't fit in any of the other categories. It's not quite a social impact game, it's actually more of an art gesture. So 96% of the games that we studied required no fee. 90% provided a single player mode. 5% also offered 2-player mode or required 2-player mode. and 5% offered 3 or more player modes, and that includes online distributed play, where you could be playing with someone across the world. Then we really studied instructions and clarity to understand how these games were designed as general experiences. And so 96% of them offered some form of instruction, typically visual or audio. 68% of the social impact games had instructions that were understood in less than 1 minute, which is really nice. While 84% of the advertising games had instructions that were understood in less than 1 minute. So you can notice that the advertising games tend to be a bit simpler to understand. 83% of all the games studied provided instructions at the start of the game. So the instruction sort of slope looks like this, where instructions at all, 93%, and then you can see a decline at the start versus during gameplay, at end of gameplay, and then external instructions. So external instructions were games that required people to go to a separate website or read some print material in order to understand how to play the game. We also studied fairly comprehensively the kinds of images that are used within a game. So, for example, when we talk about images in the art world, we actually just differentiate between natural forms, abstracted forms, and geometric forms. So here this graph basically demonstrates the number of natural forms, just over 60%, the number of abstracted forms at 30%, and geometric forms at just under 10%. Essentially, natural forms tend to look like what we see in nature. Abstracted forms are suggestive forms that have some of the elements of a natural form, but tend to be closer in inclination to a geometric form, and then geometric forms are straight geometries. We also looked at how often games used 2D isometric, or imitated 3D, and then true 3D. And you can read the paper to understand how we define true 3D, but essentially we're looking at the difference in being able to manipulate and view the world. So a true 3D render in this perspective is not necessarily a stereoscopic 3D as computer graphics would typically describe it, but more so 3D in that you can change your view, rotate your view, and there's variability there. What you can see from this graph, it's quite obvious, is that most of these games were 2D. Then we also studied how the games sound. So generally, 34% of them used a bright timbre. The definition of timbre, you can kind of look at it, consider it as sort of tonal quality, but it's more conclusively described in the paper. Most important thing is to understand that 34% were bright timbre and 32% were fast-paced rhythm. Social impact games typically offered a moderate pacing and were polyphonic, lots of different tones during their gameplay experience, and they tended to be neutral. And you can contrast that with advertising games, which tended to be fast-paced, also polyphonic, and a slight bias towards bright as opposed to neutral. The specifics are actually in the paper if you'd like to see the complete stats. Then we provided a couple of observations based on this sort of wide analysis of persuasive play. The first is that persuasive play is generally short. Most of the games that we studied, as mentioned, were 10 minutes or less before completing play. Persuasive play is also generally solitary, so most experiences were designed for one player. And persuasive play is generally 2D, as demonstrated previously. It's also generally simple to play. Instruction sets for at least 80% of the games could be comprehended in 1 minute or less. It's important to understand that a lot of these games were designed for the web for obvious reasons. And the primary reason is, of course, that it's low investment. If you've created 10 minutes of gameplay to persuade someone about the value of your product, it doesn't make a lot of sense to require them to download a game for 5 minutes and install it. So the idea is that quick play and click to play is really important. You'll also notice that most of these games are short experiences. As mentioned, only as few as 26% of them were less than 10 minutes to complete. So almost a quarter of the games offer 10 minutes of play, which is sharply contrasted with what we call the AAA game market, basically the console games and PC games that a lot of people play. These games are much more in line with what we consider casual play. There are a few exceptions. Get the Glass is a good example. This is a game that's designed as a kind of virtual board game. So it plays just as long as any other board game would. So players have to roll dice and move pieces, and all of these activities take time, significantly more time than traditional casual play in advert games. And this particular campaign was produced by the milk producers in the US, basically to promote the value of drinking and consuming milk. These games are often more like television commercials than documentary films. So if you look at the sort of structure and the use of rhetoric within most persuasive play games, you'll find that they're quick, short, simple messages, which is distinct and interesting. The contrast to, say, a documentary film is that in a documentary film, an argument may actually be constructed rather slowly, providing evidence, helping people to come to conclusions. In these games, there isn't as much evidence as there is sort of initial experience, and the experience is really expounded over a short amount of time. What's interesting is, of all of the categories that we looked at, social impact games seem to offer some of the most significant difference in the way that they're both designed and implemented. For example, 10% of social impact games provided instructions that were generally unclear after 5 minutes of review, which, if we're thinking about 10 minutes of gameplay, half the time is spent just trying to understand the instructions. That's a pretty significant amount of time. One of the reasons for this is that social impact games typically provided new game mechanics. Players were asked to do things that they don't typically do in other game environments. Basically, social impact games often struggle with this dilemma. They have competing learning goals. So players generally have to learn how to play while they're learning the game's topic. So the situation is that players are tasked with two very specific and very important learning goals in order to accomplish whatever they're trying to do in the game. And sometimes those are at odds, especially if the gameplay mechanic is contrary to what familiar players expect. So if it looks like a first-person shooter but they're asked not to shoot, players get frustrated and are trying to understand what they perceive as a more complex instruction set. By far, advert games were the simplest. They tended to rely on existing game mechanics, but some often lack novel designs. Now, this is an example of a Pringles game that we studied, and the game is very simple. It's just a sort of tunnel run adventure where player is guiding their Pringles character, shown from behind, through this tunnel, collecting Pringles. A very, very simple mechanic, and so most people understood it very quickly. There are also some other challenges for persuasive play, and this is us sort of looking ahead from the lab's perspective. The first is that we definitely noticed that too many of the games were not playable on mobile devices. Most of this came from the fact that they were Adobe Flash dependent. A lot of the games that we found would only work in Adobe Flash, so they were really only set up for at-home PC or Mac usage. And this is important. Some of these games are a bit old. We're looking at 3 to 5 years old for a few of them. And the venues for which they promote these tend to be collections of casual games that largely house and only support Flash. And the fundamental problem, of course, is that mobile developers have changed their relationship with Adobe, and Adobe isn't supported by iOS, for example, and no longer supported by a number of Android devices. So we literally couldn't even test these games on mobile devices. The other important thing to notice is that these games tend to be very ephemeral. This is an estimate because we didn't take hard and fast data on it, but basically we noticed that about 20% of the games were no longer available when we tried to revisit them 3 to 6 months after studying them. At least they weren't available from their original producers. So what happens is a lot of these games, because they're released on the web, get sort of picked up by secondary and tertiary websites that are just housing casual games and may have no interest or relationship to the product. They're just looking for sort of quick, free games to offer their audience. And so it was difficult in assessing the space of persuasive play to to accept the fact that 3 to 6 months later, a game may be missing, or it may be half implemented. So a website might pick up some of the elements, but not all of the elements. And importantly, an element that might be dropped might be the instructions. So then these games sort of exist on their own in sort of tertiary spaces in an incomplete set. So that's really all I had. Instead of asking you to watch my video for 20 minutes, I thought 15 minutes would be a better goal, and we can leave time for questions and comments. Again, I thank you, and I invite any comments now.